Alrighty. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. We're going to do something I haven't done in a really, really long time. We're going to do a commentary track. So basically how this works is you basically, if you have the same movie as me, match it up to absolute zero on your timestamp on your DVD, digital, Blu-ray, 4K, whatever you have, and we'll line it up and you can play the movie and listen to me at the same time and I'll give my thoughts on the movie. So starting off, we are going to be watching Superman the movie from 1978, directed by Richard Donner, the classic 70s Superman with Christopher Reeve. We're going to watch that all the way through. So I'm going to be using the 4K version. So this is the most recent release. It's the 4K upscale of the original Superman movie. This is not the extended version. So if your copy says extended in any way, it's not that one. That's the one that's been circulating a lot lately, and I really like that one, but I really would like to do a commentary on the movie that came out in 1978. I don't really want to do one that's altered in any way. It's just a purist thing, I guess. So if you have the original copy of Superman the movie, non-extended edition, the theatrical edition. It's it's on iTunes. It's on. I'm pretty sure it's on DC Universe. It's on. There's the Blu-ray. There's the DVD. There's the VHS. I guess there's iTunes. So hopefully, if you find yourself a copy, you can watch along with me. Otherwise, I think the talk will be good enough that if you aren't watching the movie with me, you can still listen in as like a podcast. So hopefully it won't get too complicated. So just a few thoughts before we get started. I'm really excited to watch this movie. This is a movie that I watch from time to time, pretty frequently, I would say. It's it's the classic Superman movie. If you're looking for the most classic version of Superman, this is the movie to start with. So, all right, so we're gonna get started because we're gonna be watching a whole movie. So, before I have you guys just sit here and wait forever, let's just get it started. So I'm looking at a black screen right now, and I'm watching it on my Xbox One. So the 4K is in on the Xbox One theatrical edition. I'm not in the menus. I'm in the movie has started, but it's paused, and it says Title 1, Chapter 1, black screen, absolute zero. And you should be absolute zero out of 2 hours, 23 minutes, and 17 seconds. So we are going to get started. I'm going to do a countdown, and if you guys are lined up with me, then we can get started. So we are going to start the movie in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. So the old 70s Warner Brothers logo is just appearing. And I'm going to have mine on at like a low volume, if not completely off, because you will hear it on mine, and that will be a problem. So I have subtitles on. Luckily, I've seen this movie enough that I can follow along anyway. Dedicated to Jeffrey Unsworth, if you saw that back a few seconds ago. So, when I was a kid, I watched this movie all the time. To be 100% honest with you, I watched Superman 2 more than I watched Superman 1 because I was so scared of when Superman screams at the end of this movie. Spoilers. If you're watching this commentary and you haven't seen this movie as is, that's pretty crazy. But, at the end when Superman screams, the scene and he flies up at the very end of the movie. That scared me so much as a kid that I wanted to watch Superman 2 more because that never happened. And as I got older, I learned to just respect this movie so much. I remember as a kid, I watched... It's funny enough, I watched Superman 4 a lot because it had a lot of action. And when you're a kid, you don't really pay attention to how stupid it is. So I watched a lot of Superman 4. I watched Superman 2 a lot. And then in 2006, I went and saw Superman Returns in theaters, and that was the most hyped I had been for a superhero movie since Sam Raimi's Spider-Man back in 2002. I was so hyped for that movie. And maybe we'll get to that one eventually, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But I remember, that's when I started rewatching a lot of these, and this is by far my favorite. This one's so amazing, and it makes me so happy every time I watch it. This is kind of a comfort food movie. I call it a comfort movie. So it's like comfort food, but with a movie. It's one of those that I can just put in, and whenever I've had a rough day or whenever I'm down or I need just some normalcy, I put in this movie with booming soundtrack, good quality picture. It is absolutely fantastic. So the classic title card at the beginning, which I hear costs much more than people would think. This is a high budget movie at the time, the highest costing movie I think of all time for a long time. They went way over budget because they weren't just making a movie, they were coming up with new ways of filming. So it was very difficult for them to just do the movie because no one had done something like this before up until this point. So there was a lot of trial and error. So a lot of things that were on the cutting room floor. But it turned out so great, and it was a massive, massive success. And I think the reason that this movie over the other three is my favorite is because it has the most heart and it has the most effort put into it. As you know, with Superman 2, there was a director, it's kind of like a Justice League situation. Didn't turn out nearly as bad, but, Richard Donner was fired after this one due to the budget. And Richard Lester was put in as the director, and he basically took a lot of Donner's footage and reshot it in his own terms and put a little more camp into it. And that's where we have the Richard Donner cut of Superman that just came out. What was it, like 2006, I think, maybe even a little bit later. And so there, you can tell that there was a different style with that one, and it wasn't 100% one person's vision. Superman 3 is my least favorite of the four. It's just a mess through and through. It's hard to watch. It's boring. Too much of things you don't want to see throughout the whole movie. And then, of course, Superman 4 is the cheapest and the corniest and the dumbest. But it's kind of like Batman and Robin, where it's so off-model that it's actually easier to watch than Superman 3, at least in my opinion. It's kind of like one really controversial thing that I believe in is I could watch Batman and Robin and have more fun watching that movie than I can watch Batman Returns and enjoy that movie. And that's I know a lot of people disagree with that, but for me, that's how I feel. But yeah, so this one, it just feels like quality. When I see this movie, the cinematography with Jeffrey Unsworth, the lighting, it all is just perfect. You can tell every cent is on the screen. And it's the one movie that doesn't feel like they cut corners in any way. And that's not to say this is a perfect movie, but it is, for me, it is pretty damn close. So we're coming in on the Krypton section now. And like I said, this is directed by Richard Donner. And lots of writers. Mario Puzo is one in particular. Oh, hang on one second. Sorry, I had to grab something. But Mario Puzo started out writing a screenplay, and lots of different people were involved. Sorry, I get so enthralled by just the visuals of this movie. Sometimes it stops me. It stops my train of thought because it's just so amazing. But yeah, Mario Puzo, writer of The Godfather, and it was a very campy. So they brought in Tom Mankiewicz, who had done some of the James Bond films, and he basically kind of tightened the script up, made things seem a little more real, but also very true to the character. And there's actually a great commentary, and I don't remember what version it's on, but there's a commentary with Dick Donner and him, Tom Mickiewicz, and that's a really great commentary if you're looking for commentaries for any reason. I think there's a commentary on this version. But it's the producers. So, Elias Salkind, not the best producer of all time, kind of the Avi Arad of DC. Lots of success here and there, but mainly based off of the people below him who put so much effort into it. That's what made it magic. So, going on right now, we have Marlon Brando as Jor-El, which, if you've actually kind of an infamous or famous interview is one with Christopher Reeve with David Letterman during, I guess, the press junket for this movie, where Christopher Reeve really kind of stands up for integrity, I guess, and he kind of throws Marlon Brando under the bus because Brando, I mean, it was pretty well cataloged that Brando kind of took the money and ran. He didn't put a lot of effort into this role. He usually read his lines off a cue card, and he got the astronomical $1 million to be in this movie, and he's not in a lot of it. So he was the biggest star in the world at the time. He just got off The Godfather, and it was so there were reasons behind it, but it's just crazy. And Christopher Reeve's interviewed, and he kind of talks some sense about the whole thing, and he doesn't pull his punches, even though it's Marlon Brando he's talking about. What I can say is Marlon Brando does a fine job in this movie for what he has to do. Luckily, he doesn't have to do an entire movie, because that wouldn't have, I think, worked. But for the stuff he's in at the beginning of this, it's kind of iconic, and like I said, for what he has to do, I think he does a good job. I will have to say, okay, so I've done one other commentary. I did Man of Steel, and I'm still going to be doing a kind of a series of these, and I'm going to go through all of the DCEU that we have so far. Man of Steel is the only one I've done so far of the commentary. But I thought it'd be fun to do this movie as kind of a parallel to Man of Steel. So if you want to know my thoughts on Man of Steel, I do have a commentary on that one. And long story short, if you haven't seen it, I love that movie too. I think this movie holds up better, and I think it's going to stand. This one will always stand the test of time, while Man of Steel may have some issues. And I think I have less problems with this movie than Man of Steel, but I do really like Man of Steel. But I wanted to do this one because it's a classic, and it's just, I thought it would be, like I said, a good parallel. But what I was getting at is, compared to the Krypton stuff on here, I think I do prefer Man of Steel's Krypton interpretation over this version. This is kind of the classic version that they use now all the time with, the kind of the icy world, the pillars, and especially how the Fortress of Solitude looks later on. But I think the Krypton in Man of Steel is much more exciting, a lot more fast-paced, a lot more it seems like you could make a whole movie based off of that. In this one, I don't think I could watch an entire movie that takes place on this Krypton, but if you took the Krypton from Man of Steel and you made an entire movie, I think that would be really fun, to be honest, because there's a lot of animal characters, there's a lot of life forms that you see, but you don't get like a full-on idea of. Same with Superman the animated series, where the first episode takes place on Krypton. That also felt like a world that really existed. It wasn't just all these old men standing in these ice capsules talking. And so I think I do like that a little bit more. But for what this is, that there are some really great things. I mean, like I said, it's a classic set design that has been used in comics now, and it's been used all over the place. I love the costuming where they took a material that's a kind of a reflective light. So in when the light hits it, it turns this bright white. And when the light doesn't hit it correctly, it's like this gray. It's this dull gray. So you had to be very careful because if you touched it, you'd smear it. And you get your fingerprints on it. And this is just a kind of a trick of the camera, but that stuff's really cool, and kind of how they almost talk in a Shakespearean language, like they're a more civilized world with the same problems as Earth. That's all pretty cool. And so I don't want to dismiss this entire sequence and say it's bad, because it's not. But when I was growing up, I always thought that I wish there was a little bit more. There's a little bit more interest in this section. Especially with how this movie is set up, which Tom Megowitz said is kind of like a 3-act play, where you have, and they all seem like very specific places and almost like different movies. You got Krypton, where everything's kind of cold, kind of dying, Shakespearean language, and then you get to the farm, which is my personal favorite section of the movie, which is like kind of like a Norman Rockwell painting. Everything's in sepia, and everyone is, it's ma and pa, and there's, it feels very Americana. And then you get to Metropolis, which just feels like, at the time, modern day New York, or, it was the 70s, but so, that kind of dates it now, but it feels like hustle and bustle, modern movie. And I love that. But I just wish for this section, there's a little bit more, because I think the other 2 sections of this movie are so specific and detailed in what they are that I just feel like this one kind of lost a little bit of that. It feels a little less because the other 2 are so well done. So, but I apologize if you're hearing like little knocks in the mic. I'm having to set this up a little differently. I was going to do it through a capture card and kind of watch it at my computer, so I had a stand for the mic. And there's, licensing things, and there's all kinds of, sticking a console through a capture card to be able to play a movie is probably not the easiest thing to do. So I'm actually just watching it on TV in my room and holding the mic. So I apologize if you hear some random knocks and noises. I'll try not to do that too much, but that's kind of why. Some of these lines coming up here from Jor-El, though, are some of the most classic lines in the movie that do appear later on in things like Superman Returns. You will travel far, my little Kal-El, but we will never leave you even in face of death, all that stuff. This conversation, I think Man of Steel takes a lot of cues from this whole, he'll be alone, he'll be isolated, he'll be different than them. But he, kind of says, no, he won't be alone. He'll inspire. Which is very cool. Because at the time, you have to remember, at the time, this is before even Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, and they, John Byrne came in and redid kind of the origin of Superman, and the idea is this is taking cues from what was before it, which, in 1978, you mainly had these campy 50s massive stories with Superman who's just really overpowered almost. And well, he is overpowered, and he has all, like, the super family. He has the horse and the dog and the monkey Beppo and Supergirl and the Candor, and it's just craziness, which I love all that stuff. But to introduce it to a cinematic film that, especially at this time, that would have gone over people's heads so quickly. So this was revolutionary for the time to tell a Superman story like this and do so well with it, and have it so accurate to the comic books, but also ground it. When people think of grounding a superhero movie now, they think of Dark Knight, where you just have to make everything as hyper realistic as possible. This is what I mean whenever I talk about if you want to do this character, you have to make them more relatable and more real. they don't always have to be specifically that, but these, if you need, kind of a blueprint, this is the movie. And a lot of people, like, you can go up to WB execs themselves and tell them, make it like Superman the movie. They won't understand because they don't care, for one, but two, they think of all of the history of Superman recently. They think of Man of Steel, they think of Superman Returns, they think of the animated series, they think of the comics now. And, that's been built on since then. But if you look at this movie at the time it was made, and you go back to the history of Superman, this was the way to make a superhero movie. You don't take it super serious. You don't take the material. It's the verisimilitude thing that Richard Donner made for this movie. I mean, you take the material seriously, but you don't take the world that seriously. You take liberties with it to make it so everyone can relate to what's going on, and it doesn't seem like this completely out of touch thing. But you also have humility, and you have comedic aspects, and you have you have humanity in it, and make it a little bit easier for the audience to follow. That's not taking a character and just making sure everything has an explanation down to, why these things happen. That's the comic book side of it that still works. It happens because this is the story that's being told. It happens because, there's a slight explanation, and that's all you need to know. What really matters is what's happening with these characters, what's happening in this world. So, that's the big thing for me. And, so yeah, Clark is taking off. And we start seeing the place kind of crumble. And the funny thing about this is I really feel like this section is a little long-winded. It's like, how long is it until Jor-El and Lara die? We're seeing everyone die. The planet's exploding. We know they're going to die, but let's see, let's watch them until their very last desperate moments of just going somewhere and just watching this crumble. The first hint of the Superman theme outside of the credits. And, this stuff is all just the effects at the time. I'm telling you, they were just so good. And I mean, I wasn't even close to being born around the time this movie came out. I'm much younger, but it is, if you think hard enough, or if you work hard enough at being into this stuff, you can take it and look back at a time when you gotta have a creative mind and kind of imagine what were things like before we had this? How much easier was it? How much harder was it? And when this happened, how did it change the way things work? Not just in movies, in anything. In this movie, it pushed the boundary. It pushed a lot of boundaries. Kind of like how Dark Knight Returns pushed a boundary in the sense that everyone thought Batman was a campy 60s psychedelic, fun, colorful character. And, they kind of took him back to his roots. Didn't dismiss, the 66 show, but they did, kind of say, this is what you really should be, paying attention to. These are the stories that mattered to people for so long. That inevitably led to them making the 60s show. But yeah, this is a very long, drawn out death sequence where you see all 30 people that live on Krypton die. Because that was the other thing. There were no widespread shots of people on Krypton. I think that's the other thing about it. It feels very small. It feels like a place where the council and Jor-El and Lara live, and like the council's wives. Like, those are the only people that exist. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny. And I think if they just, because in Man of Steel, it really does feel like, it's a lived in world. There are a ton of people there, especially in the animated series. And if I had to say, what are my favorite iterations of Superman, it would be, All Star Superman, by Grant Morrison, this movie, the animated series. Like, those are like the ones I think of, I go to. If not just the regular, canon Superman in the comics too, but those are like the ones I think if you really want a good feel for what the character is and what he's about, those are the things you need to look at. And in the animated series, a lot of people dismiss that show because Batman, the animated series, came out, and that was the one that got a lot of the hype, and it got a lot of the the excitement because it was the first, and it was the first time you saw the animation in a long time. But Superman the animated series came out, and if you haven't seen that, I would highly recommend watching it, because it holds up really, really well, just as much as Batman the animated series, and it has just as strong of stories and character arcs as Batman the animated series as well. And you got Glenn Ford as Pa Kent, um, who for me is like perfect. I guess I guess you could say he's just very well. His acting in this is fantastic, and this is my favorite section of the movie. As a kid, it was watching Superman, obviously, and I love all of it. I mean, I love all this stuff, but from a now that I'm older, and I'm into film more and acting more, and the way a movie's shot, which you don't really think about as much when you're a kid, at least a lot of kids. Now that I think about that more, I really respect the stuff they did here with everything. Um, like I said, it feels like a Norman Rockwell painting. You got the sepia tones, and funny enough, this movie, obviously Superman crash lands in Kansas, but a lot of this, all of the Krypton stuff, a lot of the Smallville stuff is shot in Alberta, Canada, where they found, some patches of land that looked very similar to Kansas that were flat. I still think, being a Midwesterner who lived not too far from Kansas, I still think here there's a little too many rolling hills for even Kansas in this. It does look a little more like where I'm from, Iowa, where there's slightly more hills. You could roll down a hill and go 2 miles an hour instead of not be able to roll down a hill at all, where Kansas is the flattest place you could ever go. And obviously the storyline that they took with this is pre-crisis Ma and Pa Kent, meaning when John Byrne came back to reboot kind of the origins of Superman and kind of make him a little more lean and mean with his story, and he wasn't bogged down by continuity. They made Ma and Pa live. Ma and Pa lived for quite a while into his career as Superman. And before, in this, Pa, of course, dies of heart attack, which they've used off and on throughout his origins now. I mean, he died of heart attack in Smallville. Few others. And then they kind of brought it back to, the original origin is, he was raised by them when he was very little, and they died when he was very little, and he was in an orphanage, which, obviously isn't the case anymore, but they did kind of use that a little bit more in the New 52 origin of Superman. Ma and Pa are dead again. They die in a car crash. And I'm not going to spoil too much, but just recently they came out with some new stuff in Doomsday Clock where they kind of rectified a lot of that. Because, to quote the great Ralph Garman from Fat Man on Batman, if not for Ma and Pa, Superman or Clark would not have necessarily been raised right. Everything that you love about Superman, the Boy Scout, the guy who's there to just do what's right and is the most wholesome, noble, person, that all is a branch off of the tree of the Kents. He could have definitely been raised differently if had he landed somewhere else. He would not be who we think he is. And everyone thinks it's, that's just his personality as a person when, he landed here and he became this, but no, he is basically just his adoptive parents, reincarnate. And I mean, you see some of that in like a Superman Red Sun. Now that shot actually, they had an air cannon right below his foot. So when he kicks the ball, it looks like it goes far, but really they shot it out of a cannon that was dug into the ground. Yeah, this whole sequence is just so... There's Noel Neill and Kirk Allen. Noel Neill obviously played Lois Lane in the first... in the second season and up of the George Reeves Superman show from the 50s. She played Lois. And before her, in the first season, was a woman named Phyllis Coates. She was Lois Lane in Superman versus the Mole Men, and then the series in the first season, and then she ended up taking off, and Noel Neill came in. Kirk Allen, who sat across on the newspaper, who sat across from her, was Superman in the serials back in the I think the 30s or 40s. I think the 40 it had to have been the 40s. But the movie serials, he was Superman, where he would jump and turn into an animated cartoon while he flew. Now these sequences where it shows Superman running in the dirt's behind him, they really just had a motorcycle with attached to the back of it was kind of like a cart with bags of dirt and dust, and it made it look like he was running and kicking up dirt. There are a lot of really interesting facts of this movie that, I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. So, if you are truly interested, I highly suggest, looking up IMDb or something and kind of getting the information, because there's quite a bit of stuff in this that is pretty interesting, and it's stuff that you don't normally, you don't see a lot of anymore. For instance, Jeff East, who is playing young Clark here, he's in heavy makeup, and he has a wig to make him look more like Christopher Reeve, who will be appearing here shortly. And they dubbed over his voice with Christopher Reeve's voice. So who's talking right now as Clark is Chris Reeve. And there was a big issue with that. Jeff East was not happy. And he resented the filmmakers and even Chris Reeve for a very long time. And I think what they ended up saying is that he kind of made amends with Christopher Reeve before, obviously, his death. But there was some bitterness. I mean, he's a guy who basically is being cast to play another guy, and I think he probably feels like he didn't get to do much. But, Jeff East makes an impression. He may be dubbed over, he may be in heavy makeup, but he's still the actor playing young Clark, and without doing that correctly, he would not work, and he ended up doing great. And this part, as a kid, this is another reason I never really wanted to watch this one when I was younger. The death of Jonathan Kent was always kind of traumatic to me. I took that stuff seriously as a kid. I remember when I'd watch movies, I had a weird issue establishing that these are actors and they're not really dying on screen. Um, Side story is for Man on the Moon with Jim Carrey about Andy Kaufman. For the longest time, I thought Jim Carrey died. I thought he was the one who died of cancer, and I thought that was the movie. And then I realized, no, he's playing a character who died of cancer. And, it's still sad, but I had a weird, when I was really little, I had a weird, I could never uh, put part that weird idea. It took me a while, but it was always kind of hard to watch. And this is coming up is some of the greatest music in any movie, period. The music here and the music when Clark decides to leave and go go north. Greatest soundtrack. Some of John Williams' best. That is highly underrated in my opinion. So I'm going to stop here and let you listen to it for a second. Now they used the music coming up relatively shortly when Clark, like I said, decides to leave and go north. They just recently used that in the Oscars for the In Memoriam. I think it was 2 years ago. It was the 2018 Oscars, maybe. They do the In Memoriam that they always do, where they show the significant deaths within Hollywood, and they played this music, and I remember it was very jarring for me because I listened to it constantly. I mean, I love this soundtrack, and I heard it, and I remember just instantly knowing what it was, and it was perfect for something like that. But it's not. Don't get me wrong. The music isn't 100% somber. It's not. When I listen to it, I don't get sad. It's very hopeful and very just kind of beautiful, and I love that. I mean, this whole soundtrack, I'm telling you, it's all good stuff. I mean, obviously the Superman theme is a classic. The track "Leaving Home," "Death of Jonathan Kent," that stuff's all amazing. But then you have, the flight music, the love theme, pretty much. There's actually, I know the tracks pretty well, and there's two tracks. There's a love theme, and then there's the flying sequence. They're both very similar, but a little different. And then I like the love theme a little bit more because the flying sequence, as much as I love it, one of my least favorite parts of the movie is in the flying sequence, which Lois starts doing the "Can You Read My Mind" poem, and it's awful. But besides that, so yeah, this is the whole Clark discovering his, well, really the crystal, but his ship too. There's a lot of deleted scenes in this movie too. Um, like I was talking about before we started the movie, the there's the theatrical cut, which we're watching right now, which is the cut that everyone saw in theaters in 1978. There's the extended edition, which they worked on around the same time they were getting ready for the Richard Donner cut, where they found all this footage, and it's all great footage. Don't get me wrong, I love that cut. But they have a lot of great footage of other, many different scenes. And then they have a 3-hour cut, which just recently was re-released on Blu-ray. I have that one too. You can actually get a combo. It's the 3-hour cut and the extended edition. This shot here is just beautiful, by the way. I mean, all this just farmland with the sunrise is just amazing. This is one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie. But The 3 hour cut is the TV version. Basically, when they released it, it was like a special event. I think it was over multiple days, and it was a lot of footage that they took out as well. It was a lot of deleted. I mean, it equaled out to 3 hours. And I watched that recently when I got it on Blu-ray, and that one's a tough watch. That completely halts the any kind of pacing that's in the movie. So the only time I recommend watching that is if you're a massive fan of this movie, and even for me who is, I don't think I ever need to see it again. I mean, I have it, but I don't think I'll ever watch it all the way through again, because it's a lot of the footage is kind of hard to, you can tell the stuff that was cut out because it wasn't remastered for anything like this was. And it wasn't pertinent to the story too much. The extended version is probably the most fun to watch because it has some more action and it has a few more fun little scenes. But I think overall, the pacing of the theatrical version is by far the best. It gets right to the point. It's the classic version everybody's seen. And now it's in 4K, which is awesome. I don't know if this is intentional, but the flannel kind of coat that Clark is wearing in this scene, Ezra Miller wears as the Flash in Justice League, the recent Justice League movie. And I'll probably bring it up when I do commentary on that. But I don't know if that was an intended thing or if that was just a coincidence, but I thought that was kind of interesting. That really stuck out to me. Where I was like, it looks just like the flannel that Clark wears in the Richard Donner Superman. Oh, this part here. Just the panning through the wheat field and kind of panning upwards in the music. I could watch, a whole movie around this. If they did an entire movie on the origin of Superman and they just had an entire movie of him on Smallville, not even Superboy, just as Clark, with the same characters, the same actors, I mean, I would love that. It'd be great stuff. So now we have Clark walking through the Arctic, where he eventually will create the Fortress of Solitude. And then once, this is probably the most ambiguous part of the movie. You don't really see what Superman does between this age and when he puts the costume on. There's this weird flash forward that I remember even as a kid. I was like, what's going on? Like, what happened? I mean, what happened in between? What was he doing? Was he just chilling in the Fortress of Solitude? I know that he has, his dad, and he has like a bunch of records of learning and things, but it's like, how much training could he really have done in there with how powerful he is? And I get why they did it that way, but I just thought that was funny. It's like his Jesus years, which is what Kevin Smith always says about Batman too, which they kind of rectified in Batman Begins, but it's like they rectify it in Man of Steel as well, where there's that time when he leaves Smallville, but then isn't Superman yet. They do it. They also kind of talk about it in Superman Earth 1 and a couple of places, but in most cases, it's like he lives on Smallville and he becomes Superman right after that. In other versions, he leaves Smallville like this, and then he's like 18. Then he comes back as 30, and he's Superman. And you're like, where did this? What was going on in this time? But that's what I'm talking about when it's that whole, you can be able to stretch your disbelief enough for like comic book standards, where it's like, that's not necessary. You can go with it. Like, just go with the fact that, he had this time in between, and just go with the fact that, you can make up your own conclusions as to what he did in that time frame. What we want to do is show you how he got there and what he wants to do afterwards. And that's all I need. But for a lot of people, that would bother them. So, you know, it's just one of those things that I think is perfect for a comic book movie. You got to find that balance between something that is relatable and realistic in a way, but also has that comic book charm of go for the ride. Don't worry about every single thing in it. Don't wonder why Superman flies. He just does. And there's always explanations people come out with in the comics or whatever, whether it's the yellow sun or due to their molecular density, they're able to lift off of the ground as if they're flying and kind of control the air, all that stuff. But it's like, you really don't even have to do that. It's just, those are the points where you go, just go with it. Where did they come up with the technology for Cyclops to be able to have these goggles that focus in on his laser vision? And then it goes down a rabbit hole of, well, how did he get laser vision? Oh, because he's a mutant. How did he become a mutant? What is going on in his, like, you could go forever about that stuff. That's the stuff that you got to look at and say, just go with it. When it comes to storytelling and when it comes to character development and plot and the script and the dialogue, that's the stuff that you question, because that's the stuff that will resonate more. So that's why there are bad superhero movies, and it's not usually because they're ridiculous. Some people may say that as a cheap way to get out of explaining why they don't like a movie. But Elektra isn't a terrible superhero movie because it's overly ridiculous due to the world building setup and the powers set she has. The movie is bad because it's poorly written in the sense of dialogue, plot, structure, pacing, cinematography, that kind of stuff. It's a lot more stuff you have to worry about in a movie than in a comic book. It looks much cooler to see Iron Man move his metal face in a comic book, and it seems a little more easier to swallow when you see, he's sad, and so his helmet has a little bit of a sad looking eye slits. But then if you do that in a movie, it just looks absolutely ridiculous. You have to come up with reasons, which they didn't do with Iron Man, but they did with Spider-Man. So it's just one of those things. It's one of those things that you have to go with. And this gets kind of trippy too. He does this speech and they do a lot of like weird space jelly that spins around everywhere, and the mask, the glass mask coming up. All very interesting. This is what's so good about the pacing in this one, though, in this movie in general, is just when you feel like it's starting to go off the rails. This is in a poorly made movie. This is where this would go on way too long. And you get to this point, and the talking and the dialogue, and like it kind of is stagnant. Like, okay, we get what's going on. Why are we still here doing this? Just when it's about to get to that point, and just when it's about to hit that, boom, you're in Metropolis. And you're introduced to all these new characters. It's the hustle bustle of the Daily Planet. It's the introduction of all these new characters. You see the main protagonist, or the main actor, actually, Chris Reeve. You see him for the first time, and the movie just completely takes on a new life. And that's where a lot of poorly made superhero movies, if you would compare it to this movie, this is the moment that it would start to lose. People would lose their interest or their excitement for it. So it's really good to that's one, I think, of the stepping stones in this movie to keep it up in top tier superhero movies. And I might say the effects still hold up for me, because you take the effects from this movie and you start to realize none of this is CG. There was no CGI back then. So there was a different way of doing it. And so even if it doesn't look as realistic as, say, some certain CG stuff they do, it's impressive that they got this far without it. This is the kind of stuff they could do without it. And might I also add, with CG, you can go too far with that, where it looks just as kind of off as bad camera tricks, for instance, back in the day that they used for movies. You could go all in full circle, even with the new technology we have. So I saw this movie right around the time the 4K came out, which was probably like 2 years ago. They did a special re-release screening in certain theaters for this movie. So I have seen this movie on a big screen, which I'm very happy to have done because it was a really great experience. I keep this ticket stubs in the case of the Blu-ray or the 4K that I have, but um, some of my all-time favorite movies I have been able to see on the big screen that I never got to do when they originally came out because I wasn't born yet. And so it was really great to have that opportunity. And boom, we're right into Metropolis. And it's a whole new look, a whole new feel, and you're introduced to all new characters. Almost like a whole different movie in a good way. And we get a look at Margot Kidder as Lois Lane for the first time here, which a lot of people say is their favorite Lois. She's up there for me. She was one of the first ones to really emphasize the spunkiness of Lois and like the I'm in charge of this, or you can't tell me what to do, you can't tell me how to live my life kind of mentality, the go-getter. So I respect that out of Margot Kidder. She's not my favorite Lois, but she's up there. Um, I think I would have to say my all-time favorite Lois is the animated series Lois. I think the voice actress was fantastic, and the design was fantastic, and the writing for her character was fantastic. So she's probably, when I think of Lois Lane, that's the Lois Lane I think of the most. But Margot Kidder is definitely up there. I would say my least favorite Lois is probably Kate Bosworth from Superman Returns, who was cast because Bryan Singer was good friends with Kevin Spacey, who played Lex, and Kevin Spacey recommended her. And it was a bad choice. Very bad choice, I think. And we have Chris Reeve as Clark, putting on one of the most impressive dual identity performances you'll ever see. I've taken a lot of cues from Christopher Reeve in my own acting endeavors. Not just, the dual identity thing, but just his mannerisms in this movie are so well done and so impressive that it's really great to see, and it just makes you take a lot of it and want to try to do your own kind of thing with it. So a lot of stuff that I've done performance wise, I've kind of taken some inspirations from Christopher Reeves. Just the instincts and the timing. You can tell he was a stage actor, and I mean, you can tell he was a really smart guy because he just could see everything, the ins and outs of everything, every character, his character, the environment around him. I mean, look at him in the background. He still just he's 100% on the entire time he's in front of the camera. He's never spacing out. He's never looking like he doesn't know what he wants to do. He's never, he's always reactive, but he's never, there's never a moment where he breaks out of either Clark or Superman and you see Christopher Reeves. You see Clark or Superman the entire movie. And as much as that sounds like something that is like a simple idea, it's actually harder than it looks. So that's very impressive. And I mean, everyone's praised Christopher Reeve for his performance in these movies, um, for good reason. So I'm not gonna just only talk about him the whole movie, but he, I mean, he is the reason this movie works so well. This movie would have worked. It doesn't matter what the cinematography or the writing or the pacing would have been like. Without him, the movie would not have worked as well as it did. The other thing that I like to, I don't know if I mentioned it in the comment. It's been a long time since I did that commentary for Man of Steel, but one thing that I do talk about often is with Superman is my favorite design of Superman. It has nothing to do with the costume or anything. I like a Superman who's kind of lean, but isn't a bodybuilder. That's the one thing about Henry Cavill. I think Henry Cavill fits very well, especially in Man of Steel. But I feel like Henry Cavill got a little too buff at times, where it looked like, especially in Batman v Superman, where they added some padding to his muscles, so he looked like he couldn't move. He was so buff. He looked like he couldn't, his muscles would get in the way of his natural movement, and that bothered me. And I don't see Superman as that guy who is the strong. I know that he was inspired by strong men of the 1920s and 30s, but when I see Superman, I don't think of like a, Mr. Universe or something. Like I don't see him as just nothing but chiseled muscle. I see him as kind of a guy who is he's very fit, but he's not. You don't just see muscles bulging out of every part of his body, because that doesn't, for one, I don't think that makes sense to me and how I see Superman, because I always see Superman as a guy who, anybody who is from Krypton who lands, whether they're buff, skinny, fat, whatever, they're going to have the strength, because it has nothing to do with their physical body. It has to do with where they come from and their molecular structure. So one thing I really appreciate about Christopher Reeve's Superman is he is very lean. He looks very much in shape, because he does still have to work for it. Like he still has to lift heavy things. He still has to, do all that physical stuff. I mean, it's not just all easy to him on Earth, but it doesn't look like he just pumps iron on his off time every second of every day. So that is something that, and same with Brandon Routh. I thought he was a very good build for the character. Christopher Reeves, Dean Cain, even though he's not my favorite Superman by any stretch of the imagination, those kind of looks in Superman, I think, are a little more, in my opinion, accurate to how that would work. And they typically do it right. I mean, they typically get that. And like I said, I love Henry Cavill as Superman. I think he's the best Superman we've had since Christopher Reeves. But I also think that he can get a little too heavy-handed with the weightlifting. Man of Steel, it was kind of, he got buff in his shirtless scenes, like super buff. But then by the time he was in the costume, he fit pretty well. He looked very muscular, but not like a bodybuilder. And then I remember in Batman v Superman, there are some scenes where he's standing there with Lois, and I'm like, that's too much, man. You look like you can't move. Same with Spider-Man. When Spider-Man gets too buff, which he hasn't had often, but he's also very lean and acrobatic. And if you see acrobats, they don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. They're still pretty lean and skinny. So sometimes if you see Spider-Man too buff, it bothers me too, because it's like, how's he able to be so flexible as a spider with all these muscles? And we start getting more intel and insight into the villains of the movie, which I thought was a pretty good introduction. I think the weakest part of this movie is the villain. I love Lex Luthor. He's a great villain, but um, I thought Gene Hackman was good, but also a little off model. You know, the whole I don't want to be bald for the role bothers me. He was a little too much of an actor's actor. Um, and he was a little too jokey for my taste in Lex, but that kind of has to do with the time. Like I said, this was pre-crisis, so pre-crisis Lex, you know, when he first was originated, he was a scientist, an evil scientist. Then they kind of made him an underground criminal that's smart. So this is kind of the version that you see in this is you see a Lex he's a criminal. Everybody knows he's a criminal. He's always hiding, but he's so smart that he can kind of get around it. Um, and then my favorite Lex is the most like the post crisis Lex, which is the businessman who is able to kind of sidestep around law, and he's still a genius. He's still really smart, but he's so smart that he was able to build this massive corporation. And that's where you get into the greatest, I think, kind of yin and yang of Superman and Lex, which is Lex is a guy who has all the power in the world, money-wise. You know, he's super, super smart. He has a ton of money. He pretty much controls Metropolis. The one thing he can't control is Superman, and he hates it. And there's one person more powerful than him, and it's Superman, and he hates it. And that's a really great kind of Joker Batman kind of scenario that wasn't fully utilized until the 80s. So when I look at this version, I still enjoy it, and I still think it was obviously a good choice to have Lex be his first villain. But I also feel like it's a little underutilizing the character, which they did for many years. And I think the way they went with it for the time, you know, compared to the comics, was perfectly fine. And I think it was the way as good as you can make it for a film. But definitely the modern version of Lex, I think, is a little more appealing and easier to write. This is pretty dark too. He gets pushed in front of the train. I have a phobia of like train tracks and like subway trains. Like I still can be on them, but like I have a phobia because of this movie. I have a very creative mind, so I tend to like I can picture really specific things in my head, which is a blessing and a curse, because you know the blessing of it is it makes me pretty creative and I'm able to come up with some cool things, but it's so vivid and clear in my head when I imagine something that sometimes if I imagine awful things, it stresses me out. So like for instance, that train sequence, they're looking at Amos or whatever his name is, and they show the split hat. I imagine him from his partner's perspective, what he saw, which is really just dark. And this was the kind of the start. There's a lot of things that a lot of superhero movies took from this movie, obviously, because this is the first big superhero movie. But they took a lot of like the underground layer. If you see like Batman and Robin, I think of like Poison Ivy's hideout that she gets from the Neon Group. They find these cavernous places that are tucked away inside parts of cities that you know a major city like that would be taxing and protecting and paying people to be a part of. But somehow the villains can find it and they live in it and it's massive. But this is the first one you see, and they kind of did that, you know, even like Dark Knight Rises, you know, Bane's hideout is in the sewers, which I think Kevin Smith mentions it. It's like everything's just so cavernous. There's just these massive sewer lines. Batman Returns and all this. It's like a sewer. Most sewers are very small. They can fit like one guy. They can fit one guy who can readjust the pipes and the wiring and the electricity. And then everything else is, they don't need that much room. So to see, something like this, it's like, whoa. And this is the start of the Lex who's into the real estate, which people do a lot of jokes on now of Lex Luthor, with his real estate schemes that he does in a lot of the Superman movies. And they brought back for Superman Returns as well. And that's where I think Batman v Superman kind of has an upper hand in certain aspects, as they did break a lot of those tropes that they just seem to never be able to get around even after so long with Superman Returns or something. The idea of Lex in that movie is exactly what I'm looking for. It's a modern version of Lex that you could imagine, and it doesn't bother me nearly as much as it bothers other people. Do I think it's a flawless performance? No, I don't. I think Jesse Eisenberg is a little much, and I think that there are some things that they could have tweaked, but the idea they were going for, I was all for. Man, look at that suit for Jimmy and the matching bow tie. I'd wear that. But this is, I think, and that's the other thing is, with Margot Kidder as Lois, I think this is the best, her best movie out of the Superman movies is this one. She is the most charming to me. And this one, even in Superman 2, which is still a good movie, I still think that Margot Kidder is a little weaker in that one with the material they give her. This one is the one that I think she's the most impressive. The other thing I want to comment on is, as you can see here, Clark, or Christopher Reeve, his hair's a little different and he's a little bit smaller. The one thing about this movie is you can almost always tell at the Daily Planet, especially some versions of, or some shots in Superman, especially Superman 2, but there are certain scenes that you can tell were shot earlier. Because if you don't know, which is actually a pretty big thing, but if you don't know, Superman 1 and 2 were shot simultaneously. Richard Donner was director for both of them. He shot all of Superman 1. Superman 2, he shot about 80% of. They fired him, and Richard Lester came in and pretty much took all of the footage and reshot it. There were some things he kept in, but most things he didn't. But when shooting these movies simultaneously, you can tell which scenes were on the schedule first, because Christopher Reeve hadn't quite built up his body yet to be Superman, so he's a little bit smaller, and they look a little different. Like, their hair is styled a little bit different, because eventually they kind of find their rhythm of what they want them to look like, and they kind of keep it consistent. But it's kind of interesting. You can really tell with the Daily Planet scenes in Superman 1. They're just moments. You're like, oh, like the first scene in the Daily Planet that we saw earlier with Clark, he looks bigger and his hair is different. And then in that scene, he was a little bit smaller and his hair was a little flatter and a little curlier, a little bit more like brown. And it's just because it was earlier in the shooting schedule. Superman 2, you see that in a lot of scenes in like the Fortress of Solitude when he's fighting Zod. There are scenes where he's big. I mean, he looks like he'd been working out for this part, and they had the hair perfectly styled and everything. And then there are some where he almost doesn't fill in the suit because he was a tiny guy. They talk about it in all the documentaries, and he built himself up. And he didn't look bad, but he just looks, you can tell the difference. You can tell, oh, this was something that Richard Donner shot. This is something that he used because you can tell this was earlier on the schedule. Especially when Richard Lester came in, you can really see a difference in the characters, because not only that, they look a little bit older too. And this is one of the best appearances of a superhero for the first time. Very classic. They called it when they were filming this too, the double jeopardy scene. They originally were just going to have him catch Lois. She was going to fall the helicopter, and then he was going to catch her and bring her back up. And they wanted to make the scene a little more extreme. So as he catches her, the helicopter falls off the building, and then he catches the helicopter as well. So there's two things. So they call it the double jeopardy scene. And part of this building is real and part of it isn't. So the top of this shot here where you see the whole building from the ground, it's actually a shorter building that they cropped in the rest of it. So like the whole top half is all a different building. This here where they're looking up, that like it's almost cut off there because that's where the building actually ends. And then they made it taller in post, not with CG because they didn't have CG yet. So they had to use different ways of splicing footage, and pictures and rotoscoping and things like that. There are a lot of quotable moments during this movie too. Um, some of them for like they fit very well and others kind of date it, and some really make women sound dumb, which is a product of its time. um I mean, coming up here, hey Jim, that's a bad outfit, like that's a little dated. But then you have the reporter, I just can't believe it, I just cannot believe he caught her. And then in Superman 2, when there's a little radio tower falling on a woman and she's just covering her baby in a stroller, going, "Oh my god, my baby, my baby!" She doesn't try to move out of the way. There are those quirky moments. That's a bad outfit. And here we go. This is the first Superman flying, which everyone knows the tagline for the movie was "You'll believe a man can fly." And for its time, people were impressed. And I still think it holds up. I mean, like, obviously, it doesn't look as seamless and as smooth as, say, Henry Cavill taking off in his first flight scene, or even later in the movie. But I still think it looks really good, and in some aspects better, because they couldn't turn him into a video game character, a CG character, and have him just fly around and do whatever they want, which is pretty obvious to someone who's seen a lot of movies. In this, it's like, at least, if you see a person flying, that is a real person or it is a physical object flying. And there is some respect that goes into that, I think. And just the way everyone talks about how Christopher Reeve really figured out how to make it look convincing with his arm motions and everything, to make it look like he was really banking and turning when he was flying. Not a lot of people did that much before this in film. Even like George Reeves, he typically just had his arms forward at all times. Good example is right up here, where he flies up and he kind of bends his back, and because he flies out, and he really makes it look like he's controlling his flight. Like, that stuff still looks pretty legitimate. I mean, the lighting they did very well. Fun fact of this scene coming up, you have this guy scaling the building, and it's supposed to be, that he's using these suction cups to get up, and it's pretty much the same as what they did in Batman 66, where it's just a camera on its side and they're actually facing up and down. But they add a little to it in this, where Superman's going to capture this guy, and well, he falls and he flies past, and you get the perspective from a guy sitting in his office. Now watch the guy in this office who's sitting at his desk. He looks a little off, a little bit. If you look closely, you don't notice it if you just pay regular attention, but really pay attention. Coming up here in just a second at this guy sitting at his desk. His suit looks kind of wrinkled, and he's kind of sitting funny. That guy is actually strapped in with rope or buckles or something, and he's strapped in, and he's actually sitting on the wall facing down at the ground. Well, he's kind of actually upside down, really, on like a ceiling almost, facing down. And that's how they were able to get it to look like Superman was, from the perspective of the movie, standing on the side of the building, catching the guy falling. Really, it was a guy and him standing normally, and then the guy inside the building is laying or sitting facing down at the ground. So everything looks kind of funky if you look really close, because the gravity is pulling his coat a little bit, and he's sitting kind of funny because he's strapped in, and he had to make it look like he was sitting normally. That's the kind of stuff you had to do back then. But that's what I love so much about this movie in particular, but in a lot of movies of this era, is just how they were able to get around those issues. You know, the setbacks of the time and technology, and they're able to find ways to still make it work and convincing. That's an example right there of still to this day, nobody would know if you didn't pay enough attention. And even if you did pay attention to it, you'd say he's sitting kind of funny, but that you wouldn't have any idea that he is not actually sitting normally. He's actually fighting against gravity in that scene, even to this day. And that, I think that says a lot. And as you can see, a lot of the backdrops they use in this movie are of New York City, which is very common. But that is one thing that I can't wait to really see in a movie, a Superman movie, which I think it'll come sooner rather than later. But a lot of movies, even today, most recent Batman movies especially, they film in real cities. So Dark Knight was in Chicago. Dark Knight Rises was in Pittsburgh, a lot of it. So I think the new Batman coming out with Robert Pattinson is going to be a lot of Chicago and London. So they take that and they, make it into something special that doesn't look specifically like a city that is real. Because it's not Marvel, where everything takes place in New York. It's these fictional cities based off of cities. So it's a little more difficult to make it look like the comics. Batman's city is very, very gothic, and Superman is very futuristic, like retrofuturism, I like to think of. One thing I can't wait to see, which they kind of hinted at and showed in the recent like Justice League, Batman v Superman, Man of Steel, is the city that is fictional, where it doesn't look like New York City. Gotham doesn't look like Chicago or Pittsburgh. They have very distinct looks. When you zoom out and do a pan of the city in Gotham, you see the very gothic architecture, the Anton Furst stuff that you saw in Batman 1989 with Michael Keaton. More of that, but do that with Superman and have that kind of retrofuturism looking rounded skylines that look like nothing you would see in a city today. That's one thing that I hope we can see eventually. Another fun fact here is, I think it's like Flight Control, who he's talking to, the Air Force One's talking to, the guy talking to them is Christopher Reeves. They needed someone who could do it, and I guess he was there, and they didn't want to pay another person to say those lines, so they get Christopher Reeve to do it, and he kind of has this funny like southern accent. If you pay attention, that's him. This is another classic moment. The fly. Don't look, just fly. The guy with the low voice. There's these people. It's very much like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in that sense, where even the extras or the featured characters or the side characters or just some random person that has a couple lines, they all are very memorable. They may not be specifically real, like they may not be as real as they could be, but I love that. Like a lot of people make fun of the fact that Spider-Man has a lot of these extra characters that are kind of corny. And I I love that because that makes a memorable movie. A lot of Nostalgia Critic made a big deal about the Spider-Man movies where he goes, "What is wrong with these extras? What is wrong with the people of New York in this? They all don't seem real. They seem like robots or something." And like he makes fun of a lot of them, and I'm like, "Yeah, you're right, but that's what is the charm of the movie." Instead of it being some regular Joe Schmo saying lines very poker faced, you have someone who's actually putting some fun into it. And they do that in this movie too. Like the two detectives or the soldiers who come up here shortly to who have the missiles that they're driving, or the guys that were throughout whether it's the criminals or the police officers in that last kind of almost montage of all these different things Superman's doing. They're all very unique and interesting and add a little bit of that comic book flavor to it. So I don't think of that as a negative. I think of that as a very much a positive. Even Otis, who, if they put an Otis into a superhero movie now, I think some people would think that's like, God, that's campy or corny or stupid. But you remember him. You remember the jokes. I love the portrayal of Jackie Cooper as Perry White as well. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they were originally had someone else in mind for that part. I think. Might be wrong. But I'm pretty sure that they had someone else in mind for Perry White, and he came in and he was just great. I might be thinking of a different Superman something, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. You'll have to research that. I don't know everything. Forgive me. I love looking at these extras who are all dressed and they're so 70s. It's just fun to watch. All of these outfits. One of the most fun settings for these movies though is the diner in Superman 2. I don't know what it is. I just love that feel of that diner. This is probably the best shot scene in the movie, besides some of the Smallville stuff, which I would say is up there with it. But this terrace scene is lit and shot perfectly. The colors pop. The just the way the light bounces off of the actors and the set. Some of that stuff with the backdrop, the screen backdrop with Superman standing on top. That can be kind of off-putting for something like today, but any of this stuff when they start talking here is just so perfect, especially from the over-the-shoulder angle of Superman towards Lois. It's just so well done, and the music is perfect, and the acting is perfect. This is always the scene that I go back to when it comes to everything, not just the cinematography, but the acting. This is a scene that is just always going to be in my head forever. And if I ever had to do a countdown of like top 10 best scenes in a superhero movie or moments, this would be one of them. Not necessarily the flying side of it. I mean, I do like that stuff, but this stuff here is the best written, best acted, best shot. And don't get me wrong, the movie has a lot of that, and it's that's why I love it so much. But this in particular is where it's at its best. And whenever I think of this movie, I think of this scene. And when I take a lot of cues, like I said, in my own acting endeavors from Christopher Reeve, I take them primarily from this scene. And Margot Kidder does a great job. I mean, you can see it in many documentaries, and in one that just came out, or one, it's been out for a long time, from 2006, but they just did a live stream of it on WB's YouTube, is Look Up in the Sky, The Amazing Story of Superman. And it's a documentary that they made around the time of Superman Returns in 2006. It was right when Superman Returns was coming out, and they made a documentary where they go through the history of Superman, and they interview all these people. And they show a lot of the auditions, whether it's from guys auditioning to be Superman or guys or women auditioning to be Lois. And a lot of the scenes are women auditioning as Lois, talking to Christopher Reeve in this scene. And they had some higher named actors, and they had some unknowns. And if you watch those, the chemistry isn't there. The timing of the dialogue isn't there. And then you watch Margot Kidder in this with Christopher Reeve, and it's perfect. Maybe there were some women that looked more like a Lois than Margot Kidder, but they didn't have the acting or the chemistry with Christopher Reeve to be able to pull it off. So, yeah, that's always fascinating to watch. There's a lot of that in that documentary, a lot of it in special features of these DVDs. So if you ever want to look at that stuff, you can get your hands on it. I also highly recommend watching the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. As much as it's not a complete movie, it is fascinating to see what all they changed, especially if you've seen Superman 2, just the regular theatrical version. And it really answers a lot of those questions I'm sure you had when you originally saw it, which is like, this seems different. This seems kind of goofy. Why is he throwing a cellophane S? Like, all that kind of stuff. What's with the warping? Why are they warping around? Like, it answers a lot of that stuff. And there's another thing that I was always at odds with, which is the yellow Superman S on the back of his cape. There are some versions he has it, and there are some versions he don't have it. There's some version he doesn't have it. Most versions are live action or in the comics that he has it. Most versions you don't see it are in animation, because it's really hard to animate a cape, let alone a cape with a yellow symbol on the back of it. So sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. I think I prefer it without. I like it as just kind of a regular red cape, but the yellow kind of gives it an extra bit of something too, which is cool, especially nowadays when sometimes he doesn't have red trunks. And then they've now also introduced a black version where he has a black S symbol on the back. But I think, from my opinion, I like it just a plain old red cape. And this is a really good, magical, great movie moment. Like, don't get me wrong, it is very great. The music's wonderful. it looks pretty legit. Um, there are some weak points in it though. Like I said, the "Can you read my mind" portion is kind of whack. Um, this first part is the best part of it. This whole first, like, just flying, he's holding her and they're flying past the city and she's looking down and all that. That's all great. And I think they probably should have cut it a little sooner, because once they get above the clouds, that's when everything kind of takes a slide. They start holding hands really far out where she wouldn't be able to do that. And, they do the poem and all that. But I know a lot of people come up with their own explanations as, oh, she's touching him, so as long as she's touching him, she can fly like him. Like, she has the same force of gravity or whatever that keeps her up because she's connected. And as soon as he lets go, that's why she falls. And that's fine. Whatever you want to say that makes you feel better about it. But it comes off weird. You gotta see, like, they fly past the Statue of Liberty, which is kind of funny, in Metropolis. But it really did make a good setting for the movie. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I just, at some point, it'd be really cool to get a really good look at a Metropolis that they kind of did it in Superman Returns. Like, they kind of showed that off there too. But you always see these brief glimpses, even in Man of Steel or Batman v Superman, where you see it, but you don't see it long enough to really get an idea of what it looks like. It really doesn't get a character. And the thing that I love about DC is they have these fictional cities that have a lot of character that you would not see in a city that is real. You can actually, like, the moment you see the skyline, you know who lives there, which superhero. So I kind of want to see that in these movies. I want to see, oh, we're in Central City. Oh, we're in Coast City. We're in Star City. We're in Gotham City. We're in Metropolis. Like, they all look very unique from one another, but they all fit in the kind of the same Earth. It's a minor nitpick. Like, you really, in most movies, the pacing and the way the movie flows, you don't have a lot of time to get those big spread shots of just the city. I mean, you can read a comic book where Batman is monologuing for an entire page, and instead of showing Batman standing there, you can just show the skyline of Gotham or city streets, and you can get an idea of it. And so I get that, but it would be kind of cool to see in a future movie or something. Then here comes the poem. Just very odd to me. And the way she reads it, it sounds like she's an idiot. Like, I don't know who you are. It's kind of jarring. It's not the kind of movie. This is a great shot here, though, with her in the foreground and him kind of beside her. That's a really great shot. This is the kind of stuff that gets kind of silly, because it's like she really couldn't do this. And I know people, like I said, have explanations for it, but I'm sorry. it's just overlooked. And it's funny because, like, you have two people. You have one guy in a red cape and blue tights flying, and with a woman in the night sky. And the moment they hold hands and stretch their arms out, that's when I'm like, nope, this is stupid. Like, I know it's silly. But that's just how it's just funny how that stuff works. You set up the rules of your own universe, and then whenever those rules are semi-broken, that's when you start questioning things. But this looks like Phantom of the Opera right here with, like, the fog. Like, you can tell they're on a sound stage and there's the fog and everything and the matte painting in the back, but it looks cool because of the lighting. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. See, and I think these are the moments here where the flying looks a little bit off because it definitely doesn't look as crisp. You can always tell when there's an effect coming because it's just not as crisp as just using a regular camera. But like, there it's the same problem as if you're watching a CG movie and somebody uses a lot of CG. It sticks out just as much. Like that's my argument with that is, yeah, that's obviously an effect, but so is CG. And good CG, that's when it's really great. Just like when it's really great when it's a good effect. And it just all kind of is seamless. Like the effect coming up here in just a moment. It really doesn't look altered. You see in one shot with one camera, Clark fly away. It gets a little grainy there, I guess, because it's a film. She's actually looking at a screen there. So that's why it's a little grainy, because she's actually watching a film of him doing that. And then she walks into the real life set right here, and Christopher Reeve was already dressed as Clark, so he could just come out to make it look like he flew away and came around. But when you that's also just kind of an effect of modern home video, because like you get really high quality, which it wasn't intended for, to be able to see the stuff that you see. But it's still really kind of fun to see that happen, because like I said, that kind of stuff didn't happen back then. And this is just the classic Chris Reeve transformation. Just so great to see. Just that's such a magical like moment of him being Clark, taking off the glasses and just completely transforming into almost a different actor altogether. It's just really impressive to me. It's something that a lot of people did, in the radio shows and in the Fleischer cartoons. The whole, this looks like a job for Superman, but like to see it fully formed into a performance in a movie is just, it's really impressive, because it's taking that idea and making it super three-dimensional. And I really want that newspaper. I spent the night with Superman. I know there are some props out there that you can get. I think that's one of them in the Cape Wonder Stun City. Copies of it too, not just the original pieces altogether. But there are versions you can get. It would be kind of cool to have that framed or something. And I really do like Gene Hackman's performance as Lex. However, I do think there is a specific kind of a formula for villains. And I think this is all about preference, to be 100% honest. But I believe that the best superhero villains in movies are ones that every time they're on screen, you get excited. So something like Heath Ledger or as Joker, characters like that where, you are there for the titular hero, but when you see the villain, you're like, ooh, I'm excited for this moment. And like I said, the reason I think it's up to preference is because I think there are people who watch either this movie or whatever, and they see Lex and they go, ooh, I'm excited to see what happens next with this character. For me, it doesn't quite work that way. And I don't have that often with superheroes. Like, I had it with Thanos. I had it with Loki. I had it with Joker. I kind of had it with Zod in a weird way. But it takes a lot of work to get to that point. I mean, like, one that really sticks out to me is Jack Nicholson's Joker, who, he did a fine job as Joker, but that movie is so overdone with Joker. Same with Batman Returns with Penguin and Catwoman, where it just feels like you see a character that you want to see for 5 minutes, and then you see a bunch of characters you don't care about for 40 minutes. And that might be exaggerating, but that's what it feels like. And luckily, this movie is very well balanced to where it isn't too much Lex. Like, I don't feel that way. But I do get to a point where I'm like, the Lex moments happen, and I'm like, I'm glad this is progressing the plot. It's nice to know what the scheme is. But I also am kind of like, I just want to see more Superman. And I think that's where the extended cut kind of helps. The one thing that, that was always a problem up until about Man of Steel was there's a lot of movies of Superman, but not a lot of Superman action. He lifted some big things with his strength, and he, grabbed some people, he moved fast or flew, but you never got to see him punch or do anything like that. And I know that in Man of Steel, that was like done in spades and almost too much. But there was kind of an itch that needed to be scratched there. And in the extended version, you have that gauntlet scene where Superman walks down the hallway where he gets riddled with bullets and frozen and caught on fire and all that stuff. And it's really cool to see that. Do I think it affects the overall movie? I think so, because I think it does take that pacing and it really kind of halts it a little bit, even if it's a cool scene. But it is cool to have. It's kind of like the Lord of the Rings cuts, the extended cuts, and then the theatrical cuts. Both of them are really good for different reasons. One just really fills in what you want to see and fills in all that lore. The other one makes a more solid movie. And with Lord of the Rings, I go with the extended editions. But with this, the older I've gotten, the more I appreciate just the regular cut more. I think just because of how it feels like a more fun ride than just like a, getting to know everything all the time constantly. I don't know. It's definitely a preference thing. And this is kind of like a nice levity the to the movie that, before this, you didn't get a lot of like legitimate, like funnier kind of ridiculous moments. You got a lot of charming and epic and interesting moments. And so stuff like this is really nice to see in it. Boy, if you compare like Superman 1 and 2 though, there's this scene, and then in Superman 2 it's like this scene through half the movie. But yeah, if you've only seen the theatrical cut, I do recommend seeing the extended. Would I recommend the 3-hour cut? Probably not, unless you're just like you can't get enough of this movie and this cast and the way this movie was made. If you have a lot of that, then yeah, sure, knock yourself out. For me, I am the biggest Superman fan ever. Absolutely love the character. Could watch this movie on repeat. And even so, with that 3-hour cut, it's a little tough. It's tough to get through. This is not a movie that was meant to be that long. It just wasn't. The way it was made, it was not supposed to be. I know that like the original script, for those of you who don't know, the original script to this movie was 1 and 2 together. It was one movie. And it was all going to culminate with him reversing time. So if you've seen the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, it ends with him reversing time. So it feels kind of repetitive because he does that at the end of this movie. And then if you watch Donner cut right after this, he does it again, and it feels weird. Well, it was meant to be originally, this led right into Superman 2, all in one movie. And then they kind of cut it in half to where it ends with Superman stopping the missiles, but one of the missiles breaks the Phantom Zone, and Zod and his crew come out of the Phantom Zone, and then that was kind of a to be continued. And then Superman 2 was going to be Superman 2, and then it was going to end with him reversing time. Well, once the budget started going crazy, and once they needed to get a movie out, they rewrote the end of this movie to where he does the reverse time thing at the end of this one, and that kind of has a conclusive ending. And then Superman 2 was going to be kind of how it was. However, Richard Donner was going to continue it, and he didn't have an ending yet. He never made an ending for his reworked Superman 2. So when they did the cut, they had to come up with some ending, and they would have rather gone with the original ending than Lester's footage. They tried to use the least amount of Lester's footage as possible in that cut. So they ended up using the originally filmed ending. So it's kind of confusing, and it's a really weird, like every time you ask someone, whether it's Dick Donner or Elia Solkine or even Jeff Johns, the comic book writer who worked in the Dick Donner offices as an intern, they all kind of have a different answer, because there was so much miscommunication throughout the end of this process that they didn't really know where to go with it. So I don't know. Don't take my word for it 100%, but that's what I got out of it. And so my recommendation when watching is to watch this one, watch Superman 2, then watch the Donner cut. And then I would skip 3 and 4. But if, like I said, if you are a big fan of these characters, a big fan of this plot, movies, the 3-hour cut is something to see just because you can say you've seen it, but it's kind of hard to get through. There's just so much unnecessary. None of the footage is interesting. Like the extended cut, it's cool to see that gauntlet footage with Superman walking through. It's cool to see more Jor-El dialogue. It's not cool to just see... Most of them are scenes that were cut and then reworked into another scene. So it kind of feels repetitive. But it's really fascinating how all of this works in these movies. So as you can see, the look of Christopher Reeve in this shot, he looks a little bit more put together in how the costume department wanted him to look. So you can tell this one's a little bit later in the shooting. I don't know. I guess if you've seen 1 and 2 as much as I have, you start to notice those differences. But you can also see he has some brown hair sticking out, almost red, because Christopher Reeve really has brown hair. And when he auditioned, which you can see that too, he has his audition, and he was in a suit and he was sweating crazy. They actually had to use black shoe polish and put it on his hair, give him black hair, because he has brown, and you can even see it shine through a little bit in this scene, which is funny. That's probably the 4K talking, but and like his sideburns are a little bit lighter. Coming from a fella, or I don't have brown hair, but coming from a redhead, that is so true. I dyed my hair black once for a play I was in, and any other time I was just day to day, I had jet black hair, like unnaturally black hair. As soon as I got on stage, my red hair would shine through the black, so it didn't even look like I dyed my hair. And this isn't quite that case, but you can see that really distinct brown hair he has is kind of sticks through a little bit. Now, this is the one Superman transformation in this movie that doesn't make sense to me. My dad always told me he's flying and he's just so fast at changing that he rips his clothes off and he has his costume on, but that just it's a little sloppy. It just seems very much like he just magically transported into a Superman costume, which even the revolving door is a little weird, but you could see how he could change in that by spinning around. But in a lot of the movies, he would just like start running, and then it would be like a frame by frame of just like, and then he turned into Superman. It's so weird. Some of these flying moments here, like that one there of him flying down into the buildings, those don't hold up as much as some of the ones earlier on. But man, when they work, they work. I mean, then you go to something like, for example, Superman 2, where there's a lot of moments you're like, man, that looks so real, and it's CG. and then uh, and then you see some CG where you're like, that did not hold up. He looks just like a video game character. So it still happens in modern times, even in even more recent movies. I mean, God, look at Iron Man's armor in Infinity War. Some of that just looks completely fake. So I think that's something that Hollywood still is trying to work out without having to spend too much money, I guess. The suit in this movie is also perfect. The S is a perfect size. I like the design of it. It's not that trademarked version. I call it the trademark version because it just looks so corporate. The way it's just so hard edged, and it's used on every sticker book and every backpack and everything. It just looks so. It looks more like a brand than it does his costume. So the S is not that. The colors are great. Full disclosure, I worked at Warner Brothers for 3 or 4 months, and I worked on the lot, and they have in Burbank, and they have a museum kind of on the lot of that you go to when you take like their tram tour and go through the lot and get to see everything. And going in, they have all kinds of props. They have some of the Batman cowls. They have a lot of Harry Potter stuff. They have more recent movies that they have like Crazy Rich Asians costumes and stuff, but they also have, just recently they added the Joker, one of the costumes from Joker that Joaquin Phoenix wore, but they have Superman's cape. One of them, at least. I know there were multiple, but it was one screen used cape, and it's just so funny to see it up close because, especially now that you watch this movie, in this it looks pristine, it looks brand new because it was. Now you see it and it looks like one of those blankets you get, like wool blankets or something that you get and you've used it for a couple years, and some of the threads starting to loop up and pull out, and it just looks so crude. It just was just stitched. The S on the back, the yellow S, was just stitched like something that your mom would stitch your Cub Scout patch or something. So it's just really funny how the magic of movies and cameras can make something look larger than life. This is some of my other favorite Superman work with Christopher Reeve beyond the terrace scene. I really like the way he carries himself in this scene. He's very confident but worried, but he's very real in his reactions towards these crazy two guys talking to him about all this stuff, and it shows off his intelligence. He knows what the San Andreas fault line is and everything. Like, it's really cool to get to see that, those quieter moments from Superman. Those are even better than the bombastic flying moments or whatever they may be. Just to see him standing there in that costume and just kind of talking and not in a rush, those are the moments I think that really separate this movie from other Superman media, I guess, like cartoons and things. At times they don't have those quiet moments, whether it's with Lois or with Lex or listening to a plan. He does it a little bit in Superman 2 as well, and it's all just really good to see. One thing that really bothers me about this coming up here, I don't know, is it up here? I think they've already shown it once, but like the radar room where they show the map of where the missiles are going, the map looks so weird. It doesn't look like America. It has like the states are all broken up so funky because it's supposed to look like laser lights. And by the way, that's forget his name. He's in Cheers, and he plays Ham in Toy Story when he's younger. I think it might even be Lex's viewing room, but the map, if they show it again, I'll point it out. But it's so strange looking. It's just, I don't know why that bothers me so much. It's just a very weird thing. And I always hated seeing Superman get corrupted by kryptonite as well. So coming up here when this all happens, when I was little, that always bothered me. You never want to see your hero in peril. Man, and the guy who in the behind the scenes when you see the auditions by this is the cut from the script that they used for auditions for Superman 2. And they have a guy that they talk about was Elias Sulkine's ex-wife's dentist. They had come in and read, and he's in a Superman costume, and him and this other guy are playing Superman and Lex, and it's the most unnatural, like off-putting script read you'll ever see. And you can tell he's a dentist because they're so natural. I mean, Christopher Reeve is, as much as he's not known here, he's a wonderful Juilliard graduate, stage performer, actor. And then you got Gene Hackman, who's acting legend. So, both of them working together is very great too. That water is really blue, really clear. I mean, I know it's like a swimming pool, but this set is really something else too. I mean, I know I was just kind of grilling on it because it's so cavernous, but it's a really neat set. And that was the other thing is in Superman 2, I know that, Miss Tessmacher would probably go back to Lex. She's kind of like the Harley Quinn before Harley Quinn existed in this movie, at least. And so I know that she kind of is one of those that's like, oh, you're kind of screwing with me, but I'll help you out. And then they get bailed out. She bails them out in the second movie. And I just thought that was very strange. There's that map right there. Look how weird that looks. I don't know what it's. I mean, I know what it is, but I don't know why that bothers me so much. But every time I watch this movie, I see that map, and I'm like, couldn't they make something a little more geographically correct? Especially when they're talking about pinpointing missiles and stuff like that. But what I was saying about Miss Tessmacher is I just feel like for development, I thought it was kind of a weird backtrack to have her come back in and just be how she was before this scene, especially since her mom lived in Hackensack, New Jersey, and Lex didn't care. And you would think, if anything, they would just not have her in the sequel because she moved on. And like I said, I know it's like a Harley Quinn kind of idea where, she just kind of doesn't have anything else, so she keeps going with it. But I kind of wish that they did more in Superman 2 with her to progress that character into something. I know this is very probably progressive for the time when they were making movies, so I know that they probably didn't have it on their mind. But if this were modern, I think it'd be really cool to have Miss Tessmacher and have her like Superman and save him and stuff in this one. And then in the sequel, she maybe had gone back to her old ways, but by the end of the movie, she's not just the big boobed, kind of slutty dressed woman that, that kind of stays that way. She kind of progresses into someone really interesting. And they didn't really do that. And I understand why, but, I thought she was very well. I thought she played it very well, and I thought she's a very interesting character, all things considered. And I just wanted to see more with it. And they really do take a lot from this movie and Superman 2 and put it in Superman Returns. I mean, I get those complaints because it just feels like there's not one original bone in his body besides the whole he's been gone and Lois is married, and or not really married, but she has another guy and they have a kid. And that's the only original thing, and it didn't really go anywhere. So I get the complaints with that movie, but it's just funny after you've seen that movie and then you watch this one, just how much they really did take from it. There's that map again. Seeing like there's a line that goes through into Texas and like Missouri's like super skewed. I don't know why. Just like I always get stuck on that. This is when things get serious. This is the section of the movie too where you'll see a lot of different tactics used to make Superman fly. A lot of things that they came up with throughout the making of the movie, all the trial and error. I love that shot of him flying, chasing the missile. That's one of the ones that looks so good. Face on into the camera. But you know, a lot of the movie was during the filming of it, they were coming up with new tactics and new ways of showing how he could fly because no one had ever done it before. So this is a good chunk of the movie where he has to do a lot of different types of flying. So you'll see a lot of different ways they do it. You know, there's gimbals. There's gimbals they put him on, wires. They have him on a fixed gimbal with you know, like a green screen or blue screen in the background that just projects different backgrounds for him. It's fun to watch those two in the special features to see how they could flip to the different backdrops that he's flying in front of. If you haven't seen that, look up In the Sky, The Amazing Story of Superman. I highly recommend it. It's a very, very good documentary, all things considered, because a lot of those people are they've either passed away now or they're in jail. There's a couple people in there. I won't say everybody, but Kevin Spacey narrates it. There's a lot of Bryan Singer. They're not in prison, but they're going through a lot of stuff. And then you have a couple comic book historians who I know got into some trouble with legal stuff. But all things, I mean, it has Mark Hamill, it has Stan Lee, all kinds of really great people and some really cool footage of everything. So highly recommend it. It just got posted on YouTube. If you go to WB Warner Brothers Entertainment, they did a live stream of it like 2 days ago, I think. And it's great. I love it. And for people who aren't huge Superman fans, there's a lot of really great media that no one's even heard of. And maybe I should make a video on that at some point and kind of go over some of the things that people kind of overlook or haven't heard of that involve Superman that kind of adds to the mythos or adds to the fun of the character. One example that comes to mind is the Jerry Seinfeld MasterCard commercials. Jerry Seinfeld, if you don't know, is a huge Superman fan, and he did some MasterCard commercials, and most of them had Superman in them. It's just an animated Superman voiced by Patrick Warburton, and they're really funny. And then they kind of extended that into more than just MasterCard commercials and made shorts, so you can find those on YouTube. Lots of just really hidden gems with this character, besides just the mainstream stuff. This is all miniature. This stuff here, the bus and the bridge, and most of that is using miniatures, which is cool. That's just a reversed camera. I mean, most of you probably can tell what's what. But still looks pretty good. And there's something about the kind of the grainy quality of some of this footage that gives it that charm, at least in my opinion. If it was 2 HD, it would weird me out. So that Superman is probably the one where he was flying up to the bus directly upward. That is probably a mannequin on wires. You'll see a couple more of that there, him flying across in the sky. That is him. That is a mannequin. That's one other tactic that they tried to use, and they couldn't find a whole lot of ways to do it, but they found ways, and not as many as they thought, but they tried everything: mirrors, gimbals, wires, blue screen, green screen, and other times another fact that a lot of people know, but if you don't, you'll notice in certain flying scenes that Superman's suit is a little more turquoise than it is blue. And that's because he'd blend in with the blue screen too much and he'd just disappear. So they had to, in certain flying sequences, when they used that blue screen, they had to give him more of like a bluish green kind of turquoise look, so he wouldn't blend in with the screen. So if you see certain flying scenes where pay attention, you might notice he has different colors. Especially, I think in Superman 2 more so. Now I think, is it this? That's a good shot too. He turns around and turns off the breakers and points. There's another, if you want to see the magic of movie making with him flying with wires, all you got to do is watch Superman 3. Because the majority of the times you see Christopher Reeve land in Superman 3, you'll see his wires. There's a couple times in Superman 2, but in Superman 3, you almost always see him landing, and he has a big, they didn't even bother to like Photoshop it out or anything. There's another mannequin carrying Jimmy. You can tell because they're a little more stiff. That's another miniature where the this whole Hoover Dam thing with the rocks and stuff. The town too later on. They used all kinds of great movie making special effects tactics that you don't see often anymore. It's kind of sad because it gives it a charm, and like I said, it's sometimes it doesn't quite land, but here we are in 2020, and we still have movies where you see CGI that doesn't quite land, and that is much more obvious, I think, because you can't respect it as much because you don't know. I mean, I don't want to criticize anybody who does CGI because I know it's a hard job and I know it's rewarding and it does work a lot of times, but a lot of this stuff, even if it landed or not, the special effects, the amount of people and effort and energy and actual locations that you're on to do this stuff is unprecedented. Like this with Margot Kidder with the dirt falling on her. I mean, like, that kind of stuff you don't see as much anymore. And I know that there are some filmmakers who do it, but it's just so much cheaper. But it's part of the charm to just see how much effort went into a lot of the Star Wars is the same thing. There's another, well, he might be spliced in, but that looked like a mannequin. More miniatures. You can kind of see the detail of just how it's just so cool to me. That is a very convenient rock to be that big and round, perfectly big and round. That one is obviously a miniature there with the rocks falling into the water. I just like pointing that stuff out because it's for people who haven't seen a lot of that stuff because it doesn't happen as often. It's kind of fun to know. Because the next time you watch it, you can be like, hey, that's kind of cool. Look, your eye starts to spot it. Just like CG too. Like CG, they say the more that you see CGI done for a special effect, the more your eye can tell it's not real. So the more it's used in a movie and overused in a movie, the less real it looks. It's kind of like that with this, where with miniatures and with all this different stuff, after you've seen it, you can kind of see it easily. But I just it's still fascinating to me. Like, look at that. It looks like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Yeah, this part here. This gets his facial expressions. I don't like seeing Superman look this way. Looks so like, oh crap, I forgot something. And it's so traumatic. There's another mannequin, but it's so traumatic. Like when I was, 4 years old watching this movie and I see Lois getting buried by dirt and you watch her die and suffocate and Superman's like stressed out because he realized he forgot something. And when you're older, it's beautiful because of just how it's made and the story side of it. I was talking about those quiet moments coming up here when he does make it. I love this part coming up when he stops in midair when he's flying and he still floats ahead. It's like if a spaceship had a thrust in space and they stopped their engines and the ship kept floating. It looks so cool. Coming up here in a second. It's right when he sees the car, and so he stops, kind of like he just stops, and you don't see much of it, but like it just looks cool because he just like keeps floating. But this part's well done. The music, if you listen to the music here, it has the love theme or the flying sequence theme, and kind of sad. As an adult, I love this stuff. It's very touching and very well acted and well done. But as a kid, man, it was very traumatizing. So yeah, I remember if we did watch this movie as a kid, I'd always have to leave the room or like make my dad fast forward this part because it bummed me out. Recently on Reddit, there was a post of a guy who worked on crew for this movie. He worked construction or something, and his like grandson or son found old photos that he kept, and he posted on Reddit, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of surreal. It's like a shot from a little ways away of Christopher Reeve in this standing. He's not with Lois, but he's in this spot here by her car, and he's standing, and it's so cool to see stuff like that where it's like a time capsule just to go back and see how everything looked and something that wasn't meant to be seen, but like I love that kind of thing. And then we shortly get to the scream, which is heartbreaking as an adult, mortifying as a kid. And this whole like, no, 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 no. Yeah. And then we get to probably the most controversial part of the movie and the most far-fetched. This is where I'm talking about one of those moments where, you can believe a man can fly. He can wear a red cape, blue tights, fly around, be super strong, have heat vision, stuff like that. And you're like, yeah, I'm with it. And then the moment he spins around the earth to make it go back in time, you go, wait a minute. And it really does feel like something out of a 1950s like Kurt Swan issue, but and it is weird, especially when I was like middle school, high school watching this movie. I was so critical, like this is just so stupid. I just don't, this is dumb. And yeah, it is. It wouldn't make any sense. This is not how it would work. This isn't how time travel works. But as you get older, at least in my opinion, as you get older, you start to let that go. Life's too short to overanalyze movies like that, especially a movie like this. If it's a movie that really takes itself super, super, super seriously, you're like that's where it kind of still happens. But in a movie like this, that's just there to wow you and show you great time and be a nice adventure and give you some heart filled moments and really make you think for a second, but not too much. Like, it's over. I think it's over analyzing. And I know that sometimes people think it's disrespecting a character's legacy or disrespecting how a movie should be for this character. But I think this movie earns those moments. The older I get, it's kind of like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. When I was a kid, I loved them. When I got older, I didn't like them because they were dumb. And now it's kind of come full circle where I've seen and respected everything about it. There's nothing that couldn't change me. Batman and Robin is kind of the same way. There's nothing about it that I would change, because what it is and what the director decided to do with it and how everyone put so much effort into it, it would kind of taint the legacy, I think, to say something needed to do better for a movie like this. I think for all of its quirks and all of its technical issues at times, all of its story issues at times, the movie earns it for moments like this. Him talking to Lois and just being completely... The first time he doesn't look 100% confident because he's just sitting there in his head just so happy that he saved her. And just the almost like starstruck. Those moments make up for those kind of ridiculous moments for me. If you have enough of those, and I'm pretty forgiving with movies for that reason. If you have a movie that, there's some dumb moments, or there's some moments that don't make sense, that does not ruin a movie for me. Did the movie give me a moment where I felt something? Did the movie give me a moment that I was like, yes, this is what I was looking for? That's all I ask. That's all I want. And this movie does it in spades. It does it way more than it does it does it way more than it lets me down. Superman 3, on the other hand, Superman 4, on the other hand, no. But people, criticize Amazing Spider-Man 2. That's such a good shot too. Him flying over. Oh, so good. Amazing Spider-Man 2, it's not a great movie, but it does have moments that are worthy of it existing. Could it have been better? Of course, but any movie can be. But I don't discredit that movie for the things that it made me feel, even if it was a few things. It has credit where credit's due. And some movies, there's not enough credit to give, like Amazing Spider-Man 2, where I'm like, I like those moments and I'm glad I saw them, but that is still, in the long run, not a great movie. But then you got a movie like this where it's like, yeah, there are dumb moments, but there are 4 times as many great moments. Like coming up. Him talking to the warden, that's all great. And then the classic moment, just recently replicated by Brandon Routh for a second time in Crisis on Infinite Earths on the CW. Flying over the Earth, looking at the camera, smiling at you, telling you I'm here. Thank you for watching my movie. It's just, when he did that, when he'd look at the camera and smile, as corny as it is, it was like, oh my God, he's looking at me. Like, he's not looking at the audience. He's not looking at another guy in Texas. He's looking at me. Like, he's looking directly at me and acknowledging that I am here. That's where the line between corny and amazing blurs. So that's Superman the movie. Still one of my, like I said, it's a comfort movie. It's one of those movies that when I got nothing else to do, whenever I have when I don't know what to do with myself, whenever I'm bored, whenever I'm stressed but I have time, whenever I can't sleep, whenever I feel kind of uncomfortable, I'm in a situation like moving out here to California was so hard, and I knew nobody. It was stressful. I felt like I was constantly getting ripped off. I felt like I was constantly, no one cared. I felt really alone. And I remember a few weeks into moving out here, I put in Superman the movie and watched it, and all that goes away. It just takes you away, and it puts you in a really comfortable place, somewhere that you remember, somewhere that's familiar, somewhere that you like. That's this movie for me. So it'll always be relevant to me. It'll always be one of my favorite superhero movies, if not my favorite superhero movie. Now that I've done this commentary and I've done Man of Steel, the question would be, which one do I like more? I like this one more. I think this one does more right. I think this one gets the characters a little bit more. I think the acting is a little bit better. And I think Superman is the perfect character to have this kind of sincerity, yet corny aspect. Like, some characters, it kind of breaks them if you use too much of that corny charm. Superman, the more kind of ridiculous, out there, corny moments, the better. Because when you have that and you mix it with the really down-to-earth, emotional, human levels, that's where the magic is. And that's what Warner Brothers needs to figure out, is they need to stop taking themselves so seriously. They need to stop trying to make everything like Dark Knight, which they're starting to do. I'm seeing it. Aquaman was fantastic. Shazam was fantastic, for those very reasons, because they did the same thing. You got to take it for what it is. They took Aquaman and they said, this is a dude who swims in the ocean, that talks to fishes, kind of, that talks to people underwater. We can't just change that. That's just what he is. If we're going to make a movie of him, let's make the movie of him. And they did it. They gave him the ridiculous gold and green costume. They found a nice balance between that being, thinking about it, it's ridiculous, but also being like, let's go with it. Like, there's some heart there when he's talking to his dad, when he saves his mom. Those are genuine moments within this ridiculous scenario. And that's what made that movie work. And that's why it made a lot of money. Superman, Man of Steel, the reason I do really like that movie for a lot of reasons, but the reason this one's better is because it has the formula down better than Man of Steel does. Man of Steel took itself a little too seriously. They tried to make Superman super relatable and realistic. And they need to make something akin to All-Star Superman, where you accept all of the character's history over these 80 years, and you accept all of it, and you find within that chaos of insanity and out there sci-fi fiction, you find the human moments, you find the great heartfelt moments. That's what makes a good Superman story. It's not the punching, it's not the fighting, it's not the crazy flying action sequences. That's all well and good, and that's a part of it, but the mix of that with heart is what you need. It's definitely what you need. So I'm hoping we get a Superman movie here soon. If Henry Cavill wants to come back, please. I would love to see. I know for a fact that Henry Cavill wants to make a Superman movie like that. He wants to take a crack at maybe writing part of it, and he wants to maybe take a crack at really getting the character down the way he wants it, which is the way I think a lot of people want it. So let's hope that can happen. I get really bothered when I see, as much as I like Man of Steel and I like Batman v Superman and I like how Zack Snyder handled those for the most part, it bothers me when I see newly found Superman fans bash everything that came before Man of Steel and say that the only thing that's relevant is this version of Superman. That's not fair, because without everything that came before it, there would not be what is there now. And what is there now could be more like what was once there. So, like Man of Steel as much as you want, like Batman v Superman as much as you want, if you really want to be a Superman fan, really, really appreciate everything about him, because there's more to him than meets the eye. So, yeah. But that was the commentary on Superman the movie. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I had a few technical issues in the middle of it, so if you feel like, man, I feel like I'm off with him, like he saw things earlier or later, it might have been because of that. I tried to keep them as seamless as possible. I think it was pretty close. If you have any comments on the movie, if you have anything you wanted to say, let me know. And if you made it to the very end of this video, make a comment. Let me know that you're right here with me, whether it is you listened to it or you watched it along with me. Leave a comment down below and let me know that you made it. So that's going to be it for this one. We're going to go back to doing some more DCEU stuff here sooner than later, so I hope you're ready for that. That's exciting. I have a lot of fun doing these commentaries. Just wanted to take a detour into a simpler time where a movie was really great and it needs to still be watched. So yeah, thanks so much, guys. I'll see you in the next video.